The first thing one notices is the silence. It clings to the air like damp linen, heavier than the scent of old wax or the bitter chill that drifts down the stone corridors. Inside the grey-bricked orphanage, nestled within the shadowed heart of 19th century Montreal, the quiet is not peaceful, it is oppressive. The building looms like a forgotten fortress, its crucifixes casting long shadows over the tiled floors, its iron-barred windows offering no view but of empty courtyards and withered trees. The silence here was not accidental. It was cultivated. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of the chapel, light filters through stained glass windows onto pews worn smooth by kneeling. The air smells of incense and damp wood. A visitor might hear angelic hymns echoing through the halls, sung not in joy, but in obligation. Rows of children, pale and hollow-cheeked, sing with lips that barely move, eyes fixed on nothing. There, voices blend together like ghosts trapped in ritual. Here, within these sanctified walls, faith was not a comfort, it was a sentence to the world outside. This was a place of charity. The order that ran the institution, the grey nuns, were praised as saints of the slums, devout women tending to society's cast-offs with grace and discipline. The local papers spoke glowingly of their work with orphans, the poor, the sick. They were lauded for building not only schools, but souls. Politicians visited with bouquets and promises. Church leaders quoted scripture. They said this place was God's mercy made manifest, but behind the heavy doors and locked infirmaries, another truth festered. The children arrived in various states of loss, some orphaned by illness, others abandoned by poverty or war. Many were too young to remember their parents. Some carried fevers, others carried nothing but the clothes they wore. What they shared was the hope, however small, that inside these walls they might find warmth, care, or at least safety. They would soon learn otherwise. Beds were lined up like graves, iron-framed and narrow, with thin blankets that barely held back the frost of Montreal's brutal winters. Boys and girls slept separately, but the rules that governed them were the same. No talking without permission, no crying, no laughter. Meals, if they came, were doled out according to need. A child who misstepped in prayer might lose their bread. One who wet the bed might spend the next day in silence. Kneeling on stone, the nuns moved like shadows, always watching, always listening. Their habits swished with each motion, black veils casting a deeper gloom into rooms already stripped. Of comfort, they spoke of sin often, and of salvation more. But salvation had a price. In these halls, hunger was holiness. Pain was purification. The soul, they believed, could be beaten into virtue. It is tempting to imagine this cruelty as accidental, a failure of resources, a product of ignorance. But testimonies tell a different story. Later, survivors would describe the punishments in harrowing detail. Children tied to pipes, left in cold storage rooms, whipped with belts fashioned from twisted linen. Those who cried too loudly might be forced to scrub chapel floors with their bare hands until they bled. And yet each act of discipline was framed as mercy. The abuser, they were taught, acted out of love. To be broken was to be blessed. Even the church's sacred symbols became instruments of fear. The crucifix became a watching eye. The altar became a judgment seat. And the confessional where children were forced to recount their sins became a place of psychological dismemberment. They learned to confess things they didn't understand. They learned that God saw them as wicked, and they learned that salvation was always just out of reach unless they hurt enough to earn it. Outside, the city moved on. Montreal's industrial core expanded. Factories bloomed like iron flowers. Wealth grew in certain neighborhoods, but inside the orphanage, time stood still. The walls remained thick, unmoved by seasons. The prayers remained constant, and the suffering sanctified, institutionalized, continued unchecked. In this place, the sacred and the sinister were indistinguishable. The church wore two faces. One turned toward the light, preaching charity and compassion. The other, hidden in the shadows, practiced cruelty in the name of God. And it is here, in this place of contradiction, that our story begins, not with hope, but with silence. A silence shaped not by peace, but by control, not by reverence, but by fear. But to understand how such a place could come to be, and how a city could look away, we must first step outside its walls, and into the streets of a Montreal long forgotten by modern memory. In the late 1800s, Montreal was a city on the edge, growing, gasping, and groaning under the weight of its own transformation. The factories belched smoke into skies once lit only by cathedral towers. Horse-drawn carts rattled down cobblestone streets slick with soot and blood, while immigrant families poured into the port city in desperate search of work, food, and shelter. They brought with them language, labor, and faith, but also sickness, poverty, and the burden of their dead. The city's population swelled, but so did its margins. In the narrow alleyways behind tenements, beneath bridges and in the basements of textile mills, children were born into lives their parents could not afford to sustain. And when sickness came, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, cholera, it did not discriminate, but it did linger longer in homes without warmth or medicine. Children died in clusters. Others were left alone when mothers succumbed and fathers vanished into drink or debtors' prisons. By the 1870s, there were thousands of orphans, and thousands more who were not technically orphaned, but abandoned all the same. Into this void stepped the church. The Catholic Church in Quebec was more than a religious institution. It was an empire unto itself. It controlled hospitals, schools, newspapers, and, crucially, morality. Its priests were not simply preachers. They were arbiters of community order, and nowhere was its influence more visible than in its orphan asylums establishments. It called refuges for the innocent, though few who entered found anything resembling refuge. Among the most dominant were the Grey Nuns, a religious order of women known formally as the Sisters of Charity, cloaked in thick habits and bound by vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. They had been founded in the 18th century with a mission of mercy. They ran soup kitchens and tended to plague victims. Their reputation was impeccable, and in the eyes of both the church and the public, who better to care for the city's lost children than these pious sisters of God? Donations poured in. Wealthy, Catholics, politicians, and merchants gave generously, believing their charity would nourish the souls of forgotten children. What they didn't ask and what no one dared investigate was what happened behind the stone walls. Their money helped reinforce that first glance. The orphanages looked righteous, modest but clean. Crosses adorned every room. Classrooms buzzed with the drone of scripture and grammar lessons. Inspectors, when they did arrive, were shown only the front parlor's polished wood. Freshly lit candles, children rehearsed to speak politely and sing hymns on cue. But these were performances, carefully curated snapshots of sanctity behind closed doors. The reality was far more grim. Records from the period few, though they speak of overcrowded dormitories, children sharing lice-ridden bedding, and chronic underfeeding. Staff were minimal. Medical attention was almost non-existent, and the guiding philosophy, rooted in an interpretation of Catholic doctrine, was that suffering was not only inevitable, but redemptive. Montreal's elite didn't see, or perhaps they chose not to. In newspapers, the church was still praised. Editorials gushed about the pure-hearted sisters sacrificing their comfort for the good of society. But those editorials were written by men who had never heard the night screams of a child locked in solitary for stealing a crust of bread, or watched a 6-year-old scrub latrines for failing to memorize a verse from Leviticus. City officials, too, were complicit, some through faith, others through fear. To question the church was to risk social and political ruin. Even the courts, where rare accusations occasionally surfaced, deferred to the sanctity of the veil and collar. In this unholy silence, a doctrine was allowed to take root, one that taught that disobedience was not just bad behavior, but sin, that hunger could purify a soul, that children, inherently flawed and touched by original sin, needed to be broken to be saved. This belief system, quiet, absolute, and unchallenged, shaped the very structure of the orphanages. It became the logic behind every slap, every withheld meal, every hour of forced kneeling on stone floors. Discipline was not cruelty, it was divine correction, and as Montreal boomed, the church's power grew. The city needed a solution to its orphan problem. The church offered one, and no one else came forward. The children, of course, had no say. They came in waves, some carried by desperate mothers, others dumped anonymously at night. They arrived wide-eyed and hungry, sometimes clutching letters no one would read. They were baptized, renamed, and erased. This was not care, it was containment. A system built to cleanse, not comfort. And as the decades wore on, as the city continued to expand and the grey nuns' orphanages multiplied, a deeper rot took hold. The church had not only absorbed the city's unwanted children, had made their suffering part of its holy purpose. But that purpose, shaped by centuries of theology, would soon take on its darkest form. The belief that children could be saved through starvation, silence, and pain would not remain theoretical. It would be implemented, ritualized, and enforced with iron precision, and the justifications would be written in scripture to understand what happened inside the orphanages of Montreal. We must first understand the theology that justified it. For those in power, priests, bishops, and the nuns who obeyed them, suffering was not simply tolerated, it was sanctified. Pain had a purpose. Hunger, deprivation, even humiliation was seen as divine tools chipping away at sin, carving a path toward salvation. This belief did not appear suddenly. It was the product of centuries of Catholic doctrine, medieval in origin but alive and well in the 19th century. The idea was simple and devastating, that humans are born sinful, and that the flesh must be subdued so that the soul might rise. Nowhere was this belief more fervently applied than in the care of children. Children, in this worldview, were not innocent. They were vessels of original sin, tainted from birth, drawn toward selfishness, disobedience, and pride. The role of the church was to purify them, and purification required pain. Inside the stone orphanages, this doctrine was not spoken aloud. It was lived, it was encoded in the routines, the punishments, the rituals. It was visible in the way meals were rationed, not by age or need, but by behavior. It was etched into the daily prayers, in which children were taught to thank God for their suffering and to ask forgiveness for imagined sins. Many of the orphanages were overseen by priests who acted as spiritual directors to the nuns. Their journals and correspondence, what remains of them, reveal the cold logic behind the cruelty. One priest, writing in 1883, described the children as malleable clay, full of weakness, prone to temptation. He praised the sisters for using holy discipline to burn away the vanity of the flesh. Another wrote that it was a mercy to deny food to the mouth that lies, and that obedience born from hunger is more enduring than obedience born from comfort. To the outside world, such words might sound harsh, but within the churches' walls, they were gospel. The idea that physical suffering could purify the soul has deep roots in Catholic tradition. Saints were admired for their self-inflicted deprivation. Martyrs were celebrated for enduring torture without complaint. In some theological circles, it was believed that suffering brought one closer to Christ, who himself suffered, bled, and died in agony. In the orphanages, this theology was warped further. Suffering was not just endured, it was administered. And because it was framed as holy, it could be inflicted without guilt. Children were punished not only for wrongdoing, but for thoughts, expressions, even posture. A girl who smiled at a visiting priest might be accused of vanity. A boy who hesitated during prayer might be labeled defiant. Each correction was an opportunity, a moment to extract repentance through discomfort. And discomfort was always close at hand. Corporal punishment was not just common, it was codified. Switches made from willow branches, belts cut from discarded vestments, paddles kept in drawers beside the rosary beads. A child might be struck for talking during chores, for asking for more bread, for crying at night. Each strike, the sisters told them, was an act of love. A reminder that they were being watched not just by the nuns, but by God. But it wasn't only the body that was broken. The mind, too, became a target. Silence was enforced as a spiritual practice. The less a child spoke, the more obedient they were considered. Questions were discouraged. Imagination was suspect. Children were taught to distrust themselves, to see their own desires as sinful, their own thoughts as dangerous. And over time, many of them learned to disappear inward, to become invisible in the hopes of survival. A former resident, decades later, recalled how she would stare at the cracks in the chapel walls during Mass, counting them over and over to keep her mind from drifting. If your thoughts wandered, she said, they said Satan had entered you. If you looked tired, they said you were lazy. If you looked sad, they said you were ungrateful. And if you rebelled, there was always solitary confinement in many orphanages. Small, dark rooms, barely larger than closets, were used to isolate children deemed defiant. Some were forced to kneel on salt. Others were locked inside for hours or days with nothing but a crucifix and the sound of their own breath. When they emerged, they were expected to thank the sisters for their correction. This was not discipline. It was indoctrination through trauma, and all of it every starvation. Every punishment, every whispered prayer for forgiveness was justified by the same unyielding belief that suffering was sacred, even when children died. The theology endured. Death, after all, was not failure, it was salvation. If a child perished during penance, the Church consoled itself with the notion that their soul had been made clean. In this way, death itself became a sacrament, proof that the system worked. What's most chilling is that many of those responsible truly believed they were doing good. The nuns, bound by obedience, followed the rules laid out by their male superiors. The priests, trained in rigid seminaries, believed they were saving souls from damnation, and the bishops, high in their marble cathedrals, measured holiness not in mercy but in discipline. This is what made the cruelty so persistent. It wasn't driven by greed or hatred. It was driven by faith. And when cruelty is baptized in doctrine, it becomes almost impossible to uproot, as Montreal's orphanages multiplied. This theology spread like smoke through their corridors. Generation after generation of children were subjected to it, many never questioning it, because no alternative was ever shown. But among the ranks of the obedient, one figure would rise to notoriety, a woman whose presence came to define one of the darkest chapters in this system. A woman, both feared and praised. A woman whose discipline would become legend. Her name was Sister Marthe, and to many of the children who survived her rule, she was not a savior, she was a sentence. She arrived in silence, no fanfare, no announcement, just the slow creak of wooden shoes against the stone floor and the weight of a presence that silenced even the boldest. Child, Sister Marthe. She was not young, not yet old. Her face was severe, nearly masculine in its angularity, and her eyes seemed to stare through rather than at you. Her hands, pale and sinewed, were always clasped behind her back. Except when they weren't. Then they struck with the precision of a medj. No one knew her full name. No one knew her full name. No one dared ask. She came to St. Augustine Orphanage in the spring of 1901, when a new bishop sought to restore discipline to the struggling institution. There had been complaints, whispered rumors of softness among the staff, leniency that bred rebellion. Sister Marthe was the church's answer, a woman who had served in correctional convents across Quebec, whose methods, the bishop assured the trustees, were severe but spiritually sound. From her first week, things changed. The older sisters were dismissed or reassigned. The younger ones, too inexperienced to resist, fell under Martha's command like dominoes. Children were no longer allowed to speak during meals. Eyes had to remain lowered at all times. Beds were to be made with military precision or overturned completely. Errors were punished not with scolding but with hunger, and failure, no matter how small, was framed as moral decay. Marthe believed in discipline as a form of resurrection. Her philosophy, which she articulated only once in a rare letter to her former superior, was chilling in its clarity. The flesh resists the will of God. The child, in their rebellion, echoes the fall of man. My duty is to crush the serpent's head wherever it rears. To the children, she was not human. She was law. She appeared at random hours, in the dormitories, in the laundry, in the chapel. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. A glance was enough. Her silence was its own brand of terror because it was only ever broken by consequence. She punished by deprivation. Breakfast was denied for lateness. Supper was halved for fidgeting during prayer. Entire days went without bread if a single child was caught whispering in line. One girl, whose name has been lost to time, was made too fast for 3 days for stealing a potato. Peel from the bin. Marthe believed that hunger clarified the soul. She was not alone in this. The church had long seen fasting as purification, but Marthe turned it into weaponized theology. Her girls were weighed every Sunday. If they had gained, she accused them of gluttony. If they had lost too much, she accused them of vanity. There was no safe body, no safe weight, no safe existence. Only obedience. Those who resisted were broken methodically. She kept a room on the top floor, locked and windowless. It was not large enough to lie down in. Children called it the vault. It held no light, no warmth, and no sound but the echo of one's breath. Some were kept there for hours, others days. When they were released, their voices were quieter, their eyes darker. The silence they returned with was deeper than fear. It was transformation. Marthe kept meticulous records. She wrote down every infraction, every punishment. She ranked the children by moral worth. Some were marked as pliable, others as corrupted. She used no psychology, only theology. Her favorite phrase, often scrawled beside names, in need of spiritual breaking. Yet to the outside world, she was a model nun. When local bishops or inspectors visited, they found clean halls, obedient children, spotless ledgers. Marthe could quote scripture with ease. Her Latin was flawless. She answered every question with humility and clarity. They never stayed long enough to see the bruises fade, or to notice that the children didn't make eye contact with her, or anyone. They praised her for restoring order and godly reverence to St. Augustine, but not everyone was blind. One young nun, Sister Isabel, joined the orphanage in 1903. Quiet, bookish, and devout, she believed in the mission. At first, she saw Marthe as a beacon, strong, uncompromising, but slowly doubt crept in. She noticed how the children flinched when Marthe passed, how they trembled during confession, how they cried without sound. One winter night, Isabel found a 7-year-old girl lodder-shivering in a wash-basin closet, her lips blue, her breath shallow. She'd been left there for hours, forgotten in punishment. Isabel wrapped her in a shawl and brought her to the infirmary. She wrote the incident in a private journal, and then, in a whisper, she began to ask questions. Her doubts would not be tolerated. A month later, Isabel was transferred for her own spiritual clarity. Her journal disappeared, her warnings were buried, and Sister Marthe remained. Years passed. Dozens of children came and went. Some grew up, scarred and silent. Others simply disappeared. Marthe's methods never changed. Her belief never wavered. She lived as if she were the right hand of God, carving sin from flesh with the precision of a surgeon. Eventually, her name would vanish from the public records, but the damage endured in the bones of children who grew up afraid of kindness, in the memories they dared not speak, in the silence passed from generation to generation, and in the institution itself, St. Augustine, which, despite it all, continued to operate. But change was coming, a slow, agonizing unraveling that would begin not in protest or reform, but in the cold halls of a psychiatric hospital, where a new label would be given to children like these. Not sinner, not ward, but something far more profitable. It began with a diagnosis, not a cure, not a rescue, a diagnosis, clinical, sterile, spoken in the clipped tones of men in white coats. In the early 1910s, the world was changing. Across Europe and North America, the new science of psychiatry was spreading like a second gospel. Doctors no longer looked only to priests for the cause of suffering. They looked inward, into the mind, into the brain, and what they saw in orphans, the poor, the disobedient, was not sin. It was pathology at first. The language was cautious. Children like those at St. Augustine were described as morally feeble, emotionally unbalanced, mentally defective. Then, with increasing boldness, they were labeled imbecile, idiot, degenerate. These were not words of compassion. They were weapons used to justify a system already built on silence and neglect. But now that system had a new rationale and new funding. In 1912, the Canadian government passed a series of laws aimed at protecting society from the burden of the mentally unfit. Institutions like St. Augustine saw opportunity. With a few changes in paperwork, they could recategorize many of their wards as psychiatric cases. That meant subsidies, donations, state support. It also meant that children once considered merely unfortunate were now seen as inherently broken. And once the label was applied, it rarely came off. Inside St. Augustine, the shift was subtle at first. Fewer visits from priests, more inspections from government doctors. Charts replaced rosaries, diagnosis replaced confession, but the cruelty remained. Only now it was dressed in a lab coat. Sister Marthe adapted with terrifying ease. She welcomed the psychiatrists. She quoted their manuals with the same cold precision she once used for scripture. She added new words to her ledgers: hysteria, mania, schizoid tendencies. She learned to frame starvation not as punishment, but as behavioral management. Isolation became sensory regulation. Silence became therapeutic environment. Number 1 questioned her. Why would they? She had the language now. The science, the moral war she had waged for years, was now backed by medicine. Children began to vanish more quickly. Those labeled as severely defective were quietly transferred to asylums, places with names like Saint-Jean-d'Udier and Beauport, Gothic buildings with locked doors, long halls, and no exits. Children disappeared behind their walls and never came out. No funerals, no records, just absence. Elodie, the little girl's sister, Isabel, once found near frozen in the closet, was one of them. In 1915, at the age of 11, she was sent to an asylum in Montreal. Her diagnosis: chronic melancholia with oppositional behavior. She died within the year. Her cause of death: respiratory failure during sleep. No one asked why a child needed to be sedated in her sleep. No one asked how a body so small could collapse so completely. And Elodie was not alone. A 1919 provincial report, buried for decades, estimated that nearly 60% of children transferred from orphanages to asylums in Quebec between 1910 and 1925 died within 5 years of arrival. Malnutrition, neglect, overmedication, suicide. But the reports were dry, statistical. They spoke of trends, not children. They never said her name, never said any of their names, but somewhere, deep in the bowels of St. Augustine, the files remained. Locked drawers, yellowed pages, hidden in the private collection of Sister Marthe, who kept every transfer notice, every death certificate, as if they were medals in a quiet war. And yet, this was not only her war anymore. By the 1920s, had become something else, no longer just a place for orphans. It was a dumping ground for the inconvenient. Children with disabilities, children born out of wedlock, children of prostitutes, children who cried too much, or not at all. Their sins were irrelevant. Their presence was the crime, and so they were locked away. Some were never taught to speak. Others were sterilized without consent. Many were strapped to beds, their limbs atrophying over years of stillness. The staff rotated, names changed, but the methods that St. Augustine had become a machine, a quiet, devouring machine. It was around this time that outside suspicion began to flicker dimly, inconsistently. A few journalists began to whisper of mistreatment. A nun was accused of striking a blind child. A cook reported being forced to reuse spoiled meat. A nurse fled, claiming she had seen unholy things done to the boys in the basement infirmary. But the church closed ranks. So did the government. These were poor children, after all, or broken ones, or both, who would speak for them. And so, the years rolled on, through war, through depression, through rebirth, 100 children, then 1,000. Their minds catalogued, dissected, erased. Their bodies starved, not for sin, but for science. And still, Sister Marthe endured. Older now, slower, but still present. She walked the halls with her same quiet tread. She no longer punished with rods. She didn't have to. Her presence was enough. Like a phantom in black, she lingered, until one winter, in 1931, she didn't. Her absence was not explained. No obituary, no announcement. One morning she was there. The next, her room was locked, her belongings gone. Her name was struck from the rolls. Some said she had been called to Rome. Others whispered she had been buried quietly in the forest behind the orphanage, her grave unmarked. But her legacy remained in the structure, in the routine, in the way that children flinched at a sudden footstep or wept silently into their sleeves, in the walls that held no laughter, only the echo of hunger and the rustle of medical forms. St. Augustine had become something far darker than a place of refuge. It had become an experiment. An experiment, as history shows us, rarely end with understanding. They end when the bodies are too many to ignore. And in Quebec, that reckoning was coming, though not in the way anyone expected. It would not come from journalists, or doctors, or priests. It would come from the children themselves, now grown, now broken, now speaking. And what they remembered was not madness, it was starvation. They called it fasting, they called it discipline, they called it moral hygiene. But for the children of St. Augustine, hunger was never abstract. It was not a theory in a medical journal or a virtue in a religious tract. It was a constant gnawing. Presence, an animal crouched in the belly, clawing, biting, whispering, "You are not worth feeding in theory." The orphanage provided 3 meals a day. In practice, meals were unpredictable, meager, and cruel. Breakfast might be a thin soup made from cabbage water and black bread too hard to chew. Lunch, when it came, was often a slop of overcooked gruel, saltless, colorless, barely warm. Dinner was whatever scraps remained, doled out with contempt, consumed in silence, and sometimes there was nothing at all. Punishment was common. If a child cried too loudly, they lost their meal. If they refused chores, no bread. If they wet the bed, a full day without food. Rebellion meant starvation. Kindness, too, could be punished. Sharing food was a sin of disobedience. The sisters called it withholding for reflection, but the children didn't reflect. They learned to hide crusts in their sleeves, to steal peels from garbage bins, to lick the bottoms of pots. Rats were competition, not vermin. Hunger was a game they all played every hour. Every day where the losers didn't just starve, they disappeared. Some fought, small hands clutching stale bread, eyes hollow with fury. Others gave up, going still, staring at walls, chewing their own sleeves to trick the body into thinking it was fed. The youngest simply cried, and then stopped crying. That silence was the most terrifying thing of all. But to the nuns, especially the older ones who had weathered years of war and loss, this suffering was a kind of purification. Hunger, they believed, was redemptive. A child who suffered in this life might be saved in the next. And if they died before salvation, that too was God's will. Yet even among the sisters, there were degrees of cruelty. Sister Beatrice, broad-shouldered and thick-knuckled, ruled the kitchen like a fortress. She rationed potatoes like gold, hoarded butter for the staff, and had a habit of ladling soup with a satisfied sneer. She once told a boy who fainted from hunger during Mass that he collapsed because Satan was leaving his body. Another nun, Sister Helene, was quieter, nervous, twitchy, always glancing over her shoulder. She sometimes slipped extra scraps to the sickest children, but never in sight of her superiors. Her fear was palpable. She had seen what happened to those who broke the rules. They vanished to dot in 1932. A local inspector named René Dubois was sent to Saint Augustin after an anonymous tip. He arrived unannounced. What he found shocked even his jaded sensibilities. Children with limbs like twigs, bellies distended from prolonged hunger, boys with open sores on their gums from vitamin deficiencies. He recorded in his private journal, "It is not an orphanage, it is a prison. And they are not wards, they are inmates of starvation." But the official report was different. Under pressure from both the church and the provincial government, Dubois was ordered to revise his findings. The final document praised the nuns for their austere but holy stewardship. The accusations were dismissed as the orphanage was allowed to continue. What Dubois did not know, what no outsider yet realized, was that Saint Augustin was not unique. Across Quebec and much of Canada, orphanages were quietly being transformed into psychiatric facilities under the pretext of care. Children deemed difficult or degenerate were transferred to avoid overcrowding and justify state subsidies. And food was one of the easiest, most effective tools of control. It cost nothing to starve a child. It left no bruises, only shadows. But in Saint Augustin, hunger became more than punishment. It became policy. By the mid-1930s, the institution implemented a tiered meal system. Children who obeyed received a full ladle of soup. Those who failed, chores received half. Those who showed signs of moral agitation, a term that included everything from crying too often to resisting prayer, were placed on what the nuns called restricted nourishment. These children received one meal per day, a bowl of weak broth and a crust of black bread. Some survived for years under this system. Others did not. Coroner records from nearby hospitals in Quebec City show a disturbing trend between 1935 and 1940. Multiple cases of child mortality due to complications of malnutrition. Most were labeled as orphans. Some were listed as previously institutionalized, but never named. The church buried them quietly, sometimes literally. In 1938, a groundskeeper named Lionel Rousseau reported a foul smell behind the east wing of the Saint Augustin property. He found a shallow pit. Inside, small bones, loosely wrapped in stained cloth. The authorities were called. The official explanation: animal remains. Rousseau was dismissed. The next week the hunger took its toll on more than just bodies. It warped minds. Children began hallucinating. Some claimed to see angels, others saw demons. One boy, Jean-Luc, aged 9, began biting his own fingers, convinced worms lived inside them. He died of sepsis in the infirmary. The cause of death was listed as self-inflicted wounds during delirium. He had not eaten in 3 days, and still the world did not see. Newspaper articles from the era praised the Saint Augustine orphanage for its discipline and moral rigor. Photographs were staged, rosy-cheeked children smiling stiffly. in borrowed clothes, hands folded neatly on wooden desks. No one took pictures of the infirmary, or the closets where the punished were kept, or the beds with no mattresses, only straw. No one asked why the children never laughed, but the children remembered. Decades later, in the 1980s, long after St. Augustine had been shuttered and renamed, survivors began to speak. Old men and women. Now, with trembling hands and sunken eyes, they told stories that chilled even hardened journalists. And always they spoke of hunger, not just as pain, but as message. They were starved, not just because food was scarce, but because it was power. Because it reminded them, 3 times a day, that they did not matter, that their suffering was invisible, that they were expendable, that they were not children. They were experiments in silence. And as one survivor, now in her 70s, told, a reporter with a flat voice and unblinking stare, they didn't just steal our childhoods, they fed them to the rats. But the rats were not the most dangerous creatures in that place. That title belonged to those who made hunger holy in the quiet world of state bureaucracy. Evil doesn't arrive with a scream. It comes with a stamp, the machinery behind the Duplessis. Orphans was not built in shadows or secrecy, was built in filing cabinets. It wore suits, carried pens, and spoke in the dry dialect of government forms. At the center of the paper trail was a single word: certified. To be certified insane by the province of Quebec in the 1940s required only a signature, not of a psychiatrist, not even of a doctor, but of a government clerk, a hospital administrator, or more chillingly a Catholic priest. And that certification could be based on nothing more than behavioral concerns, emotional volatility, or unfit social origin. Translated plainly, being poor, loud, angry, traumatized, or inconvenient. And so, the orphans of St. Augustine and dozens of other institutions were reclassified, not as orphans, but as mental defectives. The shift was administrative, clinical. Diagnoses were not necessary. The goal was not treatment, but funding. Psychiatric institutions were eligible for more money than orphanages, nearly 3 times as much per child. It was a simple calculus for the church and the provincial government. More certifications meant more dollars. More madness meant more money. In the files, it looked clean, tidy even. The names of children were typed neatly on forms labeled transfer to care. The reasons were vague: disturbed behavior, moral weakness, agitation. No follow-up, no appeals. Once labeled, a child could vanish from one building and reappear in another, this time behind locked doors and barbed wire. And yet, for decades, no one asked questions, because the paper told a different story. On the ledgers, the children were cared for. They were receiving treatment. They were sheltered under divine guidance. Auditors from Ottawa, reviewing budget allocations in the late 1940s, found no irregularities. The numbers matched. The books were balanced. No one visited the basements, or the padded rooms, or the unmarked graves, but the truth was there. It whispered from between the lines. In inconsistent birth dates, in multiple entries for the same child, once as an orphan, later as a patient, in memos sent between bishops and provincial ministers, using language like reclassification, incentives, and enhanced care rates, language as camouflage. Sister Engel, a former nurse who later broke her silence in a 1980s interview, described the regime as one of corrective purification. She recalled a boy who wouldn't stop asking for his mother. He was given a calming Series 3 electroshock sessions in 48 hours. Afterward, he stopped speaking altogether. He lived in a fetal position for the next 5 years. He had been 7. These were not isolated incidents. The use of aversion therapy was common. Children who wet the bed had their hands tied overnight or were denied meals. Girls who displayed affection hugging each other, or a nun were accused of moral danger and locked in isolation for days. Punishments were framed as salvation. One nun wrote in her diary, "Silence is the language of the soul. Their screams are demons resisting grace." Medical ethics had no place here. Doctors who visited from Montreal's psychiatric circles rarely stayed long. Some left disturbed. Others looked the other way. The church maintained an iron grip on access, insisting that the children were receiving God's discipline, and that outsiders could not understand the burden of spiritual correction. But a few took notes. A 1953 report by a disillusioned intern, Dr. Mark Ledger, was never published, but fragments survived. In it, he describes an experimental group of 10 children aged 8 to 12 undergoing insulin shock therapy, treatment then used for adult schizophrenics. The sessions induced seizures, nausea, and, in 2 cases, comas lasting over 24 hours. There was no oversight, no therapeutic rationale, just observation and always silence. In interviews decades later, surviving orphans described the experiments in fragments. Some recalled being strapped down. Others remembered being forced to swallow pills that made them sleepy or forgetful. One man, Henry, recalled a room with a red bulb overhead and a man in white who never spoke. He remembered screaming, then nothing. The goal wasn't healing, it was compliance, and compliance required breaking something inside the child. Sister Angle admitted that by the late 1950s, discipline reports were written monthly and circulated not only within the asylum but to government offices. Children were graded on obedience, silence, and religious participation. Those who failed to improve were often moved to more severe wards, where physical restraint was common and death was not rare. One such ward known only as the furnace room, in survivor testimonies, housed boys deemed irredeemable. It was in the basement of a converted monastery, lit dimly and always cold. Children slept on straw mats. There were no windows, and when one of them died, a simple form was sent to the provincial office. Cause of death, complications of infirmity, number, autopsy, no family, no funeral. They were buried in unmarked graves behind the walls of the institution, sometimes with a rosary, sometimes with nothing, and always no one asked. Because who would ask about mad children? Who would care? The silence was systemic. It wasn't just the nuns or the doctors. It was the provincial inspectors who rubber-stamped budgets. It was the federal agencies that saw increased psychiatric patient numbers and sent more funds. It was the parents, often single mothers, who had been told their children were being raised with God's love and never dared to question the church. And when children did escape, those rare few who managed to age out or sneak away, they found themselves in a society that had no place for them. Without education, family, or documentation, many turned to crime, addiction, or the streets, and even then, no one listened, because a vagrant shouting in the night, "He must be mad." The church, even into the 1970s, maintained that the institutions had saved more lives than they had harmed. In one chilling public statement, a high-ranking cleric remarked, "We gave them structure, where otherwise there would have been sin." But the survivors would later reveal what that structure cost. It cost voices, it cost bodies, it cost childhoods, and it left behind a legacy of shattered people, half-formed adults, caught forever in the echo of a silence that was cultivated like a crop nurtured by faith, fertilized by bureaucracy, and harvested with cruelty. They had no screams left, only whispers, and those finally began to rise. For decades, the silence held. But silence does not mean stillness. And in the shadows of Quebec's glittering cathedrals and ivy-covered hospitals, memories stirred. The first cracks appeared in the 1980s. A few former orphans, now grown men in their 40s and 50s, began to speak. Their testimonies were disjointed, blurred by trauma, and often met with disbelief. Who would accuse the sisters of charity? Who would challenge the medical establishment, or the very church that had built modern Quebec? But pain, long buried, finds a way to the surface. It began with stories on radio shows, anonymous, fragmented, almost whispered, then letters to local papers. Then, in Iten Jobai Joshi, an expose broke on national television. Its title was blunt and damning, The Orphans of Duplessis. The country was stunned. Viewers watched grainy photos of children in straitjackets, read hospital reports labeling toddlers as schizophrenic, and listened to testimony after testimony of electroshock, beatings, and solitary confinement. The images of children chained to bed frames were not from the 19th century. They were from 1959, and suddenly, the public could no longer look away. The story ignited a national scandal. Politicians scrambled to deny involvement. Church spokespeople offered measured statements of sorrow, laced with caveats and legal caution. The institutions had followed the standards of the time, they insisted. The province had merely lacked the resources for proper care. And besides, who could have known? The answer, of course, was everyone who looked. Between 1945 and 1960, the number of children labelled mentally deficient in Quebec nearly doubled. Reports had been filed. Inspectors had visited. The Vatican itself had received letters begging for intervention. They all looked away. But the survivors didn't forget, and they didn't stop. In 1992, a group of them, many former residents of Saint-Jean-de-Dieu and Mont-Providence, filed a class action lawsuit against the Quebec government and the Catholic Church. The case was unprecedented. They weren't simply suing for abuse. They were suing for fraud. Their argument was clear. They had been misdiagnosed as mentally ill, not for treatment, but to inflate asylum numbers and secure federal funds. In short, their suffering had been monetized. The government resisted. The church denied wrongdoing. Lawyers for the defense argued that no law had been broken, that the definitions of mental illness had been more fluid at the time, and that intentions, however misguided, had been rooted in care. But the truth could not be explained away. By the mid-1990s, hundreds of survivors had come forward. Some spoke with clarity, others with hesitation, their memories fractured by years of institutionalization, but all echoed the same haunting details: beatings, restraints, starvation, isolation, and that ever-present word, silence. The pressure mounted, public opinion shifted from disbelief to outrage. Editorials demanded justice. Documentaries aired, late into the night, replaying the voices of men and women who had spent their childhoods in locked wards for no crime but poverty. In 1999, the provincial government finally responded. Quebec Premier Lucien Bouchard issued a formal apology, not just for the abuse, but for the system that allowed it. He acknowledged that the state had colluded with religious authorities to falsify records. and that children had been wrongfully institutionalized by the thousands. It was a historic admission, but it wasn't justice. The church refused to participate in financial reparations. Negotiations dragged on for years, with survivors aging, dying, and slipping through the cracks they had lived in since birth. Some passed away just months before. Settlement agreements were signed. Others refused compensation altogether, saying that no money could erase what had been done. The final settlement, awarded in 2001, offered a one-time payment to each survivor. It was symbolic. It did not cover therapy, education, or lost family, but it was something. More importantly, it was a record, an acknowledgement that they had not imagined it, that their lives had been taken from them, that the walls had been real, the straps, the silence, the electric shocks, they had all happened. And finally, someone had written it down. Yet not all were satisfied. Many survivors and their advocates noted that no one had been prosecuted. Not one nun, doctor, or government official had been charged. The institutions remained open, renamed, remodeled, sanitized. Some continued to operate under the same religious orders. The church issued pastoral statements of regret, but no full apology. The reckoning, in many ways, remained unfinished. But the voices had risen from the margins. A once forgotten group of abandoned children had become something else entirely, a mirror, a reflection of how power, when unchecked, will disguise cruelty as care, how institutions built to save can also destroy, and how belief, religious, political, or otherwise, can be twisted to justify the most intimate violence. The Duplessis Orphans were not just victims, they were evidence, and that made them dangerous. In the years since, their story has been retold in films, novels, and courtrooms. Schools in Quebec now include their history in some curricula. Memorials have been erected, names carved into stone where once there were only numbers. One inscription reads, "They took our voices, but not our truth." It's a line that echoes, decades later, with the quiet power of those who endured the unimaginable, and then stood up to tell the world exactly what it looked like. And yet, even now, one question lingers unanswered. How many others were never found? Long after the headlines faded and the legal dust settled, the legacy of the Duplessis Orphans remained uneasy, unfinished, and quietly haunting the edges of Canadian memory. Not because it was resolved, but because it wasn't. The names of the children are mostly lost, their hospital records doctored, missing, burned. In many cases, the only evidence they ever existed lies in psychiatric intake files, where a 7-year-old boy is declared incurably psychotic for not responding to a priest's catechism, where a girl of 5 is deemed sexually deviant for crying at night, where siblings are split and scattered like dust, and their cries buried beneath layers of clinical detachment and institutional routine. History didn't forget them. It buried them. For decades, those who had once been the orphans of Quebec carried their scars in silence. Many never escaped poverty. Some never learned to read or write. Others lived and died homeless, institutionalized again in adulthood, trapped in the cycle they'd been born into. And yet, even in the darkest corners, something endured. A few survivors, though weathered by trauma, became fierce advocates. They wrote memoirs, they spoke in schools, they testified before parliaments. Their voices, once erased, became the central force in rewriting an uncomfortable national narrative. Their work changed laws. It forced religious orders to reconsider their role in caregiving. It forced politicians to reckon with a time when poverty was pathologized and obedience was valued more than empathy. But change came slowly. Even now, many Quebecers speak of the Duplessis Orphans in hushed tones. The church, though bruised by scandal, still enjoys broad influence in some circles. Many files remain sealed. Others were mysteriously destroyed during the early stages of the lawsuits. It's not just about memory, it's about accountability. And the truth that justice delayed is justice denied. The story of the Duplessis Orphans is not just about Quebec. It is not just about Catholicism or politics or one premier's thirst for order. It is about what happens when we mistake silence for virtue, when obedience becomes more important than compassion, when systems designed to serve the vulnerable instead feed on them. This was not a tragedy born of individual cruelty but of collective blindness. A whole society turned its face away from the poor, the sick, the unwanted. It outsourced the burden of care to the church and called it moral. It paid subsidies for each child, declared mentally unfit, and called it economic prudence. It locked away tens of thousands and called it mercy. The legacy of the forgotten is a cautionary tale, because for every Duplessis orphan we now name, there are thousands more whose stories will never be told. Babies buried in unmarked graves. Children who died in asylums with no family, no inquiry, no obituary. Girls who disappeared after speaking out. Boys who grew old behind locked doors, convinced they were insane because that's what they were told. Every day of their lives, and that legacy lingers, even in today's modern institutions, hospitals, orphanages, juvenile facilities. One must ask, how do we treat those with no voice? Who speaks for the unwanted now? Who monitors the rooms where restraint straps still exist? Who reads the reports no one wants to write? The past does not remain in the past. It seeps forward quietly, persistently, till it demands to be reckoned. With Dot, in 2020, a survivor named Roland began planting trees, one for each friend he remembered from the asylum, one for the boy who hanged himself at age 11, one for the girl who disappeared during a blizzard, never found. He calls it the Grove of Silence. Visitors who walk there are not greeted with plaques or statues, just small wooden signs with names etched in charcoal, some real. Some imagine Dot, because sometimes giving someone a name is the only dignity left to offer. The legacy of the forgotten isn't just about the children who were starved and beaten and drugged. It's about how icily we forget what suffering looks like when it wears the face of power, when it wears a habit, when it recites scripture, when it signs a government form and stamps it final. It is a reminder that the cruelest systems are not those built in anger but those built in certainty. Certainty that obedience is noble, that poverty is shameful, that silence is holiness. And so we return to the halls of Montprovidence. They are mostly empty now. The stone walls still stand, cloaked in ivy. Tourists pass them without pause. A private school occupies one wing. The chapel hosts weddings. The nuns are gone. But if you listen closely, in the long corridors where sunlight cuts across faded tiles, in the basement rooms where rusted locks remain bolted to the walls, in the iron bed frames stacked in storages, can almost hear them the footsteps of small shoes, the hush of prayers spoken in fear, the click of a rosary wrapped around a trembling wrist, and the echo of a question that still waits to be answered. How holy is a place if it forgets the children it was meant to protect?